Well, it's time to get back into our study. If you were not with us before, we were just in the week 2 of a study series. It's going to be about 6 to 8 weeks long that fits into kind of a larger model of things that are going on within our church, but also I think within your life. When I say that, there's a season that we've been in for about a year and a half where we believe God's leading us as a church to a new season. And there's been a lot that we've covered through that, and as we continue to kind of take that ground or continue to take that path, and I'll explore that with you as we go. But again, it's not just for us as a church. Okay, I hope that our fellowship is leaning into it from a church perspective, but I believe this is true for anybody that senses that God's leading them someplace new, that God's leading them to a new place or a new season in their lives. And I just wonder, do you feel that? Is that something that you sense? Is that something that you dream of? Is that something that maybe you gave up on at one point and you just think things are never going to change, but now something seems to be stirring? If so, then I hope this is a series that really leans into your life as we're talking about overcoming obstacles. See, as a church, from that perspective, we've had kind of 2 main tools driving us here of late. And when I say here of late, I don't mean over the last month since COVID-19 showed up. I mean for the last year and a half. And one of those is a prayer where we've been praying, and it comes straight out of Isaiah. We've been praying, build up, prepare the road before us, and remove the obstacles from in front of your children. That God has a purpose, He has a vision, He has a plan. We have a good sense of where that's going over the last year and a half. We've seen a lot of movement in those areas and a lot of changes within those areas. But help us to remove those obstacles that make that path stumble. At the same time, we have on this other side this truth that comes when it comes to God's vision. I'm going to ask Jenny to put this up on the screen for you for Vision Sunday. Is a slide. Jenny, you got me on that? She's not, because she's on Facebook Live. She's going to hear me in a second. But as we put that up, there's a truth when it comes to God's vision that whenever He reveals His vision into our lives, then automatically there comes up fears. Satan will automatically come against it and will start thinking about, do I have the money? Do I have the time? Do I, what will people think of me when it comes to that vision and moving forward in a new way? And we have found that depending on what our response is, on how we handle those fears and those obstacles, depends on how God's really able to move within that in His own response, and whether or not we have His hand upon us and we move into the full flow of that vision, or whether or not there's challenges and struggles out there. So when you look at these 2 things together, that there is going to be fears, there is going to be obstacles, and we're praying for God to remove those. There's a truth that what we do impacts how that works. So that's why we're in this series of talking about obstacles and talking about these things, and we're doing that in the mix of looking at the book of Joshua. Matter of fact, you can get your Bibles out and get there if you want to. This week, we're going to be in Joshua chapter 2 as we continue to this story. And the reason that we're here with them is that this is the second time that they have come up to God's vision for the Israelites, for God's chosen people, that they took and moved forward into this promise of the promised land. The first time they came up against it, the fears came up and they abandoned it. And God had to lead them back into the desert for 40 years. But this time they're coming up and they're doing it in a new way, so we want to learn from their lessons. Last week, as we went through chapter 1, we went through the aspect of the vision, of it being renewed and Joshua being called and what God had for him and how Joshua responded and how the people responded to receive that vision. And again, if you missed that, you can pick that up pretty easily at tsflife.com or on our YouTube channel. But this week, we're going to start leaning into those obstacles. And it's going to take a couple weeks how we do that. I don't want to immediately go into this is how we blow the obstacles up. There's some steps before that we see within Joshua 2 that I think will help us quite a bit when it comes to taking God's vision and looking at those fears that are on us. So we're going to do what we usually do. We'll read a little, talk a little. We're going to cover quite a bit in this chapter. And I think we're going to come up with about 5 hints or 5 bullet points I'd like to give to you, so that you can use this in your own life, and we can use this as a church family when it comes to those obstacles. So let's start out in verse 1, where it says that Joshua, the son of Nun, the leader, he sent 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies, saying, "Go, view the land especially Jericho. Now, I realize we haven't gone through an entire verse yet, but I want to stop here because there's quite a bit to cover here. As a matter of fact, the first 2 points I want to share with you out of the 5 come out just this first half of this first verse. If you're a note taker and you got your journal, as we kind of suggested with this one, or you're making notes in your computer, I'm going to give you the first point and the second point back to back, and then we're going to explore them together. The first one is this. When we come across obstacles, we need to identify the obstacles. And then the second point is we need to understand those obstacles. Let me talk about that a little bit, because I think our natural self when it comes to obstacles and fears that come into our lives is we kind of see them and pull back just a little bit. That we start thinking about those challenges. Yes, I went to this event and I heard somebody talking about missions, and I feel like I'm supposed to go on a mission trip, but how am I going to get the money? How am I going to get the time? I'm not that kind of person. We kind of pull back a little bit. What I want to suggest is when it comes to following God's vision, and we see these obstacles, that we actually lean into them instead of away from them. We want to identify what they are, and we want to be able to understand them fully, so then we can start to understand how God's going to move within them, to face and define these obstacles. This past week, we had a series called How to Be Stable online. It was an online series Monday through Friday. And we were talking about breaking the chains in our life, like how to get away from the bondage or the muck and the mire. And we said then, you can't break the chains if you don't know the chains. You can't identify the chains. So these things really do come to being important. And they have several obstacles in front of them. They have fear. They have the Jordan, which is a flood level that they have to cross somehow. And they have the inhabitants of the promised land. In the past, this has scared them to the point that they pulled away. In this case, he's leaning in. I want to go, I want to see, I want to understand, so that we can get a full picture of what we're going to be dealing with. In no way, shape, or form is he saying, let's see if we can do this. He's saying we've got to understand it and identify it, because we are going to do this. How is this going to work? How is God going to move within it? So when we identify them, then we can start to understand them. In this case, he says that he wants them to go in, especially in Jericho. And the question becomes, why especially Jericho? And there's a couple reasons for that. One is just military smarts. Like if you're watching this from a movie standpoint and what they're doing, Jericho, it makes the most logical sense if you want to be victorious. It's right in the heart of all the surrounding communities. I mean, if they came in from the weakest standpoint, they would have defeated them very easily, but then they would have these constant reserves of backups coming at them as they're trying to go north. This was right in the center. It's the most fortified city. If they take that out, that's going to put fear out into these other areas. It has resources that it puts out to these other areas, that if we defeat this area, they don't get those resources anymore. They're not going to be as strong. There's a lot of military reason to say, especially Jericho. Let's understand that obstacle. But I think there's a second reason I'm going to hold on to for a second before we get into it. I think there's a God reason for it as well. But they wanted to understand it, so they send 2 spies, not 12 spies like before. And I don't know why that is. My guess is, one, it's a little bit symbolic. When the 12 spies went in, 10 came back and said, everything God said about this land is true. And the other 2 said, yep, absolutely, we agree with them. And these guys said, but we can't take it because of those enemies, because of those fears, because there's obstacles. And these 2 guys are like, wait a minute, God's promised. And Joshua is one of those guys. So I don't know if it's somewhat symbolic of those 2 guys. I don't know if he wanted a smaller number for those who work within ministry. A lot of times, the more talking heads you have at the beginning of it, the harder it can kind of be sometimes. So maybe he wanted a smaller team. Maybe he just knew these 2 guys, and he knew that they were going to look at it from a faith perspective and trusted them to go into it. But he sent them in to be able to understand the obstacle. So how does that look in our lives? I know when we look at it from a church perspective, the elders and the staff and other key people in different areas, we spend a lot of time in prayer and talking about obstacles and what will keep us from this next season so that we can understand them well. We all know we're not capable of blocking through those just by our own sure will, but we've got to understand them and bring them to God well. When your personal life, well, let's go back to that mission trip. It's one thing to say, well, I feel like God's called me to go on this mission trip, but I just don't have the money. And then if you lean away, then the conversation's done. If you say, I don't have the money, and then you say, well, what about my money don't I have? Well, I've got a lot of credit card debt. And every month I'm paying so much money in credit card debt that it puts me into a bondage, because in my past I got a little foolish and I went through an emergency, or sometimes I want to get nice stuff because I want something for me. Well, let's talk about that. Now we have something that's workable, that we can understand. How did we get here and how do we get past it? How do we work this in such a way that we can do what God's calling us to do on this mission trip, but be able to get freedom in this area of bondage in our lives? Or if it's, I feel like God's calling me to work with kids at the church when this reopens and everything, but I just never have time. I never have time. Well, why don't you have time? Well, we've got 3 kids, and this one's in 3 sports, and this one's in musical, and this one's over here taking a work in a job, and we have to run them around, and my husband's here, and my wife's here, and we're all over the place. Well, now you got something tangible to look at. Are you stewarding your time well, or are you just saying yes to everything? And now you're overwhelmed, and you're letting that schedule get to a place to where you cannot use your gifts for God and for the ministry and for the kingdom. Now, I'm not saying those things are bad. You could be doing great ministry in the bleachers. That's great. But maybe in your case scenario, things got out of control, and you want to, right now, in this time where everything's stripped away, start thinking mindfully, do I want to go back to that schedule? Was that the best for my family? Am I teaching my kids priorities? Do we have freedom? Are we in the Word together? Do I want to do some differences on the other side of this? When we identify truly what the obstacles are, then we have something that we can understand and work. Most of the times we just say, well, that's just the way it is. And we just think that's the way life is supposed to be, and we don't do anything about it. That's not kingdom living to the point where you're learning how to walk God's path for your life. What are those obstacles? What are those challenges coming into place? Identify them and understand those obstacles. In this case, Joshua wanted to send these spies and get a little bit of a view of what they were dealing with. In the second half, I think we're going to find another spot, and it's just this. Number 3 is give God the obstacle. And I think, I struggle with that. I think it's probably a better way to word that. I never quite came up with it, but it just seems like that's the overall, is once you have that obstacle identified, you need to release it to God and let Him start working on it in a way you would never expect. The second part of verse 1 says this: the spies went, and they came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and lodged there. Now, where do I pull giving God the obstacle out of that? Well, if I was writing a movie, the first step, and they don't give us a lot of details, I wish they kind of did, of exactly how they ended up in that situation, but the first step is not, okay, we're in a new place, we want to check it out, let's go to the prostitute's house and hide. It's just not worldly logic. In this case, Rahab doesn't even make worldly logic, because in this culture at this time, I would think you'd be going in and trying to find strategic allies that you can use behind the walls when you're coming to attack, but they go to a woman. And again, I have no problem with that, but that culture of the time, that is not something they would do. A woman at this time is considered property. In this time, they don't just choose a woman, they go to a prostitute or led to a prostitute as an ally. So she's not just property, she's everybody's property. And she doesn't necessarily have a good reputation in town, and she doesn't have a lot of stature to come into this. And she's not just a prostitute that's a woman, she's a Gentile, so she's not even Jewish. She's not part of the Israelites. She's not part of God's people. And then they're coming to her for some kind of hope and some kind of refuge. And then she's not just a Gentile, but she's also an Amorite, which is when you go through and God's talking about the land of the people that need defeated so that they can have their land. Amorites are right up there on the list. And so she's the enemy from beginning to end. And yet this is who God hooks them up with. That God works into the obstacles in a way we don't know. Because God never looks at the external things that you and I look for, money and time and relationships and all the things that feed us, but He looks at the heart of the individual, and I think that is such good news for all of us. I think that is such beautiful news, because none of us truly have a lot of control on whether or not we're great when it comes to the eyes of the world. Matter of fact, most of us spend most of our time not even looking at the positives in our lives, but at the places that we feel like we fall short. but we have full control over having a heart for God and having submission to God and having an excitement for His vision and His passion in our lives. We have full control over that. And that's why it talks about from beginning to end how God loves to use the least of these, because then He gets all the glory, because all we're doing is saying yes, and then He moves and everybody just goes, wow, wow. And in this entire city, why this makes no sense whatsoever, God led them to one person, the only person who had a heart for Him in this city. The only one that had faith in God in this city. She made no logical sense, but He started removing the obstacles for these folks in their lives, and not just for the spies, but for Rahab herself. When you go through Joshua, you see a lot of God defeating the enemy. We're going to go through a lot of the sections. We're going to see a lot of defeating the enemies. But when you look through it, you've got to see that He's also saving and rescuing as well. It's kind of like with Revelation. I know a lot of people get stressed out studying Revelation because of all the end time stuff, and here's the mark of the beast, and here's the dragon with the 7 heads, and all these things. There are scary things in there if you're not with the Lord. That's exactly what Joshua is. But when you lean into the Lord, there's so much praise and worship in Revelation, and here we see that He continues to move and to save and to take obstacles out of our way so that we can have the fullness of Him. That's a lot of time on verse 1. Let's go to verse 2. That's going to give us a little bit more insight of what happens as these two different groups connect. It says, "It was told to the king of Jericho, behold, men of Israel had come here tonight to search out the land. And then the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come to search out all the land." There, I get 2 voices instead of a half of one for you. As they come into her home, the word starts getting out. They are aware the Israelites are on the outskirts. They have some things as we go through here, some concerns about that. When they hear that the spies are in town, then it goes to the king that they're in Rahab's house. Now, the king probably has never spent any time thinking about Rahab in his life. She has probably almost always been in the back shadows and the back hallways of the community that she lives within. But now, all of a sudden, all attention is on her. And the fourth thing that I would bring up when it comes to obstacles is something that makes 100% sense to all of us, but yet seems to shock us all the time. You need to know, if you're going to start going down these paths of looking at obstacles, whether it be in our church or in our own lives, in our families, our community, if you're getting bold enough to lean into the obstacles, understand this. When you see the obstacle, it's going to look like a mountain. I don't know why it shocks us every time that the attack of the enemy looks huge and looks challenging and looks scary and overwhelming. But a lot of times it knocks us off our guard. Next thing you know, we're in a place that's filled with anxiety. We're in depression mode. We're overwhelmed. We've got all the fears weighing on our shoulders. Just know up front, obstacles of the enemy look huge. They are mountains. In this case scenario, as she starts to lean into what God has for her, then she starts seeing what the obstacle looks like. The king is paying attention to her. All the people in the town know that she's got these spies or had some dealings with these spies. She has a command come upon her. I want to know where they're at. I want them delivered. I want them up front. And if she does not obey, she is up for a death penalty. This obstacle looks huge, and that she has to look at what that means and what that looks like next steps in her life. From there, we also have the spies are looking at a pretty huge obstacle. The spies are looking at a big challenge as well. Do they trust Rahab? They don't know Rahab for nothing. They have death on their list, and that the only person to stand between them and being captured and being killed is a Gentile prostitute that they don't know. That looks huge. There's a lot of obstacles. There's a lot of challenges that are there. Whenever you go after God's vision, just know it's going to look pretty impossible. It's going to. And that's, when we're in the right spot, is a good thing, because that means only God can bring it together. Only God can be victorious over it, and He gets the glory for His kingdom. For some reason, it shocks us. Don't be shocked. That's just the way it is. Those mountains are going to look huge. The challenges are going to be overwhelming whenever vision is put before us. Fear and obstacles come up, but the thing that matters is what? Our response. Do we respond like the world, or do we respond like Christians? Let's see what she does here. I think you probably know the story or could know the story, but let's see what happens. Verse 4. But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. And she said, True, the men did come to me, but I did not know where they came from. And when the gate was about to be closed at dark, the men went out, and I don't know where they went. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them. But she had brought them up to the roof and hid them in the stalks of flax that she had laid in order of the roof. So the men pursued after them on the way to the Jordan and as far as the fords. And the gate was shut as soon as the pursuers had gone out. Now, this is kind of the first half of 2 parts I want to bring together for the same point. But again, number 5 is going to be respond in faith. If our obstacles are removed because we have the choice of responding in fear or faith, then we have to respond in faith to be able to be in step where God has us to be. And that's what she did here. Now, let's do a sidebar. Let's talk about something that really doesn't impact the entire study, but something that comes up often in this particular point of the scripture. Was Rahab faithful when Rahab was lying? Was the lie somehow not a sin? Is there a such thing as a lie that is not a sin? And the answer is no, there's not. Lying is a sin, and what she did here was a sin. And I know when we talk to some folks, they can be shocked by that. But to be honest, if you read the Bible just verbatim, the heroes of our faith sinned. The heroes of our faith stumbled. The heroes of our faith did things that they kind of wish probably wasn't written down for thousands of years. Noah got drunk and was laying naked on his bed. David took and had a relationship with Bathsheba and killed her husband to cover it up when she got pregnant. None of us are perfect people. We all need grace and mercy. Some will say, but wait a minute, if you go over to John chapter 7, you got a place where Jesus lied. His brothers come up to him and say, hey, are you going up to the city? It's time for the festival, and you should go up because you're the Son of God. They're making fun of him because they didn't believe he was the Son of God until after his resurrection. And Jesus said, no, I'm not going to go up. And depending on what translation you read, I'm not going to go up. It's not my time yet. You guys go on ahead of me. And then next thing you know, they go, and he goes another path, and he sneaks up there, and he shows up at the synagogue, and he's teaching. People say, well, Jesus lied. It must be okay if he didn't sin, but yet he lied. We have some translation issues there because the original text, Jesus is saying, I'm not going up yet. It's not my time. He didn't say he wasn't going up altogether. Jesus didn't lie. Lying is a sin. That's just the way it is. Now, do I judge her for that? No. I'll be fully honest. If I was standing in my house and woke up in the middle of the night and found a guy at our front door with a gun asking me if my wife and my daughter was home, I'm going to tell him no. For a self-defense standpoint, I probably would sin in that moment. But I just want to make sure we don't make it into something that it's not. Some might say, well, what about Hebrews 11, where we've got the heroes of our faith listed out and why they're counted as faith. Rahab is listed there. The Gentile prostitute woman is listed amongst the heroes of our faith in Hebrews 11, but it doesn't say it's because of the lie. It says in verse 31 of chapter 11, by faith Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. So she is absolutely faithful, but there was a stumble here, an understandable stumble, but a stumble. But I don't think that's where the focus should be. I just kind of want to address that because for some reason it comes up a lot, and I understand that. But the real focus here is not whether or not she stumbled, but whether or not she was faithful. And she was faithful, especially in spite of the circumstances. We're going to see that this continues in verse 8. Verse 8, it says, before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the kings of the Amorites who were before the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that, as I have dealt kindly with you, you have also will deal kindly with my father's house, and give me a sure sign that you will save alive my father, my mother, my brothers, and my sisters, and all who belong to them. and deliver our lives from death. And the men said to her, Our life for yours, even to death. If you do not tell this business of ours, then when the Lord gives us this land, we will deal kindly and faithfully with you. Rahab's response was generally just, I know the Lord wins. Rahab leads into the Lord in spite of the fact that it means she has to give up her past, and she has to give up her community. She has to give up everything that she has and identify with God's people. Choose to identify with the Lord, not her own people who had the same choice. Okay, you see this? This is just like the vision aspect. She had the fears, but she leaned into the Lord. The other people could have done the same thing. Everybody in that town could have said, we've heard the story. She's already told them their hearts are melted, their souls are melted away. Everybody in the town is terrified. They could have simply laid down their weapons. They could have simply said, you know what? Everything we hear about your God is exciting and it's true. He is a true God. It is evident to us. We want to turn our lives over to God. They had that choice, but they leaned into fear instead of faith. We have a very clear example, just like with the Israelites, between Rahab and her people. She had to denounce all of this to be able to lean into God. She had to submit and put away the old life into God. And then these folks continued to rebel and pull against him, and as we know, probably did not go all that well. They were embracing the testimony. She was talking about the things that he had done. We had faced these things. We heard about the Red Sea. We heard about your other victories. We heard about the goodness of God. But she responded with faith. So this is going to be my second side point for you, because this is the type of thing that happens a lot in the Scripture, especially through the Old Testament, that I just love. We see it a lot in Moses' life. But we definitely see it here, where we see foreshadowing of the gospel message of Jesus Christ, where we see it in a metaphor or in an action. And let me explain that a little bit. Rahab, in many ways, takes and represents you. We're all sinners. We have all fallen short of the glory of God. All of us had different areas where we rebelled against him. Even as Christians today, we struggle within that as we grow. To choose faith more instead of fear or self-control more. Rahab really represents us in this picture. And in this moment, we see her, in our terminology, coming to Jesus. I've heard the testimonies. I've seen God. I need to turn my life over to Jesus. And we do that by accepting him as leader and forgiving our lives, by acknowledging with our mouth that he's the Son of God, believing in our hearts he died and rose again, and following him, truly following him. It's not like a quick prayer and all of a sudden we get to go to heaven and that's all we got to worry about. We follow him. We give our life back to the Creator and we move forward with him. And in response of that, he saves us. He saves us. I love their response in verse 14. Our life for yours, even to death. And that is your response from Jesus to you. Even to death, my life for yours. He took the cross for us. He took the resurrection for us to open up this gift and this door. You might say, well, Tom, I think you're kind of reading into it a little bit too much. You're trying to make it something that it's not. In this next section, the plan for her salvation is for her to take a scarlet cord and put it at the window so that they see it, and that is going to be the mark of her salvation so that her family is saved. This is exactly the same as when they had the plague of death, where the angel of death went over Egypt, and they said, you will not be marked by death. You will not lose a firstborn son if you mark the doorframe with the blood of the Lamb, which is a foreshadowing of Jesus Christ. When you accept Jesus as leader and forgiver in your life, you are forgiven, and you are covered by the blood of Christ with all of its power and its grace and its mercy and all of its purpose. And you are marked with the scarlet cord for salvation. From the beginning, from the time that Adam and Eve screwed up, he was constantly working to save you, to save me, and to save all of mankind. He is not a God who wants to have people perish and punish. He is constantly working to salvation, his life for yours. And we see this in the story of Rahab. And when you have that kind of God at your side, at the moment that he's saying, look, this is what I have for you with this life that I saved you for, and then all of a sudden you see this mountain of obstacle standing there, and I've got that God here, how could I possibly put my focus there instead of him? How could I possibly say, I've got to manage that somehow, I've got to figure out a way around that, I've got to get my own tracking gear and make it of my own accord and my own power and my own strength, instead of looking to him and saying, I need you. I need you. This is the way obstacles should be working in our lives, the way we see it in Rahab's life as well. As we go through 15 through 16, she talks about the escape plan. She comes up with the escape plan for the spies. 17 through 21, they're talking to her about her escape plan and her families. 22 through 23, we see that the spies escape and they come back to Joshua, which leads us to verse 24. The spies come to Joshua and say, truly, the Lord has given all of the land into our hands. And also, all the inhabitants of the land melt away because of us. How beautiful would it be if we could get to the point that our response to the obstacles in our lives is this. Truly, I tell you, it's God's. Truly, I tell you, that means nothing compared to Him. The Lord has got this. Truly, that is going to melt away in front of Him as He moves. We're not talking about that obstacle being removed yet. We're going to talk about that next week as we get into chapter 3. We're not talking about removing the obstacles in your life and some of the tangibles and how that works. We're looking at looking at the obstacle, say, I want to understand you, I identify you in the obstacle, and then I'm just going to, just kind of turn here and go, here you go. Just tell me what my part is. How could we not do that for a God who says, truly, my life for yours. Truly, I have more for you. That we can say, truly, the Lord has given this into our hands. I pray that you find some encouragement to that, and I pray that you bring a kind of passion into this conversation for us as a church. I pray that you're praying, man, I don't know how many times we have prayed within the walls of the church, build up, build up, build up. Prepare the road before us and remove these obstacles. Our choice of faith into it, so these obstacles can be removed. I don't know how often you pray that during the week. I don't know how often you think about it when I'm not leading it, but I pray that God just really takes your heart. So as a church family, we can say, truly, God's doing some great things. Truly, there's some things that are just outside of our very concept that we couldn't even imagine a couple months ago that God is doing, and that it's got to be for His good. Truly, He is melting mountains, and that we come together as a church around that, but also just within your own life. I really believe that maybe one person just got sucked into this for a few minutes and caught into this, and maybe it's just all about God's vision for your life, and maybe you coming to Him for the first time, or maybe you taking and coming up against a hard wall right now. God's got you until we believe it, not just know it, until we believe it and we live it. No mountain will move from in front of you. But the faith of a mustard seed, faith of a mustard seed, God will do miracles in your life.